My father had narcissistic personality disorder. He was never officially diagnosed because, well, he never went to therapy, but I lived with him for 18 years before his passing in the mid-90s. And me being me and given what I do, it's safe to say that that's what ran him. In addition to being NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, he also had complex post-traumatic stress disorder. From what we know and what we gathered from his childhood from extended family, not that he was going to be authentically giving of that information because the idea that he had any internal problems was ego dystonic to him, meaning it wasn't in line with his image of himself. He'd often, even in addition, he would often speak highly of his own father, my grandfather, who can be easily defined as a highly sociopathic alcoholic. He grew up in extreme abuse, and in many ways it was more horrific than my own, but I don't say that to minimize my story or celebrate his. Generational trauma is complex, as each generation has its own challenges. And as a side note, I think comparing our own trauma to our abusive parents is a slippery slope. I think it mucks up the following. I think it mucks up raising the bar of better parenting ourselves as a species, because I think we'll ignore the abuse from our parents out of understanding or too much compassion. I'm not saying the compassion is bad there, but it also mucks up the process of holding abusive parents accountable for passing on to the abuse to the earlier generation. So my father had all the trappings of malignant narcissism. He was grandiose, he was neglectful, he was emotionally and physically violent, he was profoundly vulnerable, but unaware of it. He was Machiavellian, vindictive, entitled, competitive, manipulative, demanded adoration, dark triangle kind of stuff, blah, 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 blah. And he was also a sporadic alcoholic. He wouldn't drink for weeks at a time, but every time that he drank, he would do so to the point of intoxication. The alcohol isn't the root for the narcissism, although those two things can look similar. And I believe being abused as a child, as well as having a genetic disposition, formed who my father was. And I believe he was ruled from both ego and from survival-based defensives. So about narcissistic personality disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So looking in depth at these two issues, NPD and CPTSD, what are the differences? What are the similarities? An NPD individual certainly has both, since NPD is mostly a result as the childhood environment. In other words, with both issues, it's all trauma, but not all childhood trauma results in NPD. CPTSD is a diagnosis that differs from traditional PTSD as it refers to multiple traumatic experiences over time, rather than just one traumatic experience like a car accident or war or an assault. CPTSD is not recognized in the US by the APA, which is kind of odd, but it is recognized in other countries. In my work, I use the term CPTSD interchangeably with childhood trauma, with more trauma through the individual's life as a result of the childhood experiences, such as choosing abusive partners because they're just familiar. CPTSD doesn't have to involve childhood trauma, but in my mind, I think it usually does. And believe it or not, I think there are large parts of both CPTSD and NPD that look very similar. Both get extremely activated and triggered, and when we get triggered, we lose our ability to see the humanity in others, and we become self-focused, we become self-consumed, and both often live in a triggered state at baseline, kind of in a 24/7 experience. This video is going to explore these two psych issues, and I hope it's helpful in rethinking yourself, rethinking our quickness to label others as narcissists, and rethinking our family system if we're still confused. If you identify with recovering from CPTSD and childhood trauma, this video might be a little bit hard. It might name some things about your own behaviors, which is always hard, but that always leads to a greater sense of self-awareness and recovery. If you're new to me or new to the channel, welcome. If you like this video, feel free to hit some buttons on the screen. You really can't miss with any of the buttons, especially the like button or the subscribe button. Subscribing to the channel greatly increases the capacity to reach people and greatly increases the community around this channel. And if these videos are helpful to you and helpful to your recovery, you can consider supporting the work that goes into this channel over at my Patreon. In addition to that, you can go to my website and check out some childhood trauma e-course work that I offer there, including an upcoming upcoming webinar that I'm offering on Saturday, April 9th on overcoming the toxic family system. That's a live event with me, followed up by a live Q&A on all the material that we go over. If you follow this little white ball up here, that'll take you to register and to learn more about the webinar. You can get in touch with me through my website, you can get in touch with me through my Instagram, and you can also connect with me over at my TikTok, and I'll have all the links in the description of this video. So, okay, so here we go. So before I show the infographic, a little about the dark side of Patrick, and it's always fun to talk about yourself in the third person if you're inclined to do so. So at times, in my early recovery, I was extremely reactive, especially around if I felt that others were letting me down. I was extremely controlling around how things kind of might look, like in group settings, like playing in a band, that kind of a thing. I was also pretty chaotic in my dating life, starting things out of loneliness or desperation, and then quickly deciding that I didn't want what I had just started. And I tended to have very intense, fast connections, which I think is really in line with a lot of the childhood trauma stuff. I could also be outwardly moody, took things way too personally, struggled with anger, had some pretty heavy, high maintenance kind of energy going on with myself. I didn't always brush my teeth or tip waiters. I'm just kidding. I was just making sure you were still with me in this horrible confession. I've never not tipped a waiter, I think, but I definitely skipped on brushing my teeth here and there. Anywho, what to make of all that I just described? Think about that presentation I'm about to show that I just gave, and think about it in terms of the infographic that we're about to go over on these two issues. So yes, there's a lot going on with this infographic. This is not new info, but narcissistic personality disorder involves the following: lack of empathy, grandiosity, self-importance, relationally uses others, treats others as supply for their image or for their self-preservation, is highly manipulative, covertly or with an overt aggression like with the malignant, and is preoccupied with things like conquest and adoration. An individual with this disorder has a broken self-monitoring system. Think like a camera that's in our psyches watching what we do. Was that joke about the waiter thing too much? Am I being extra? And that lack of self-awareness makes them shameless, makes them insufferable, arrogant, and shallow. And notice in the middle that I have this phrase, fixed ego. We're going to come back to that later. On the other side, on the right side, for c-ptsd, as a result from childhood trauma, the diagnosis usually involves hypervigilance, self-sabotage, shame, lack of affecting others, real or imagined, relational attachment issues like control. Try not to think of it about as just being a controlling person. There are other ways that we can be controlling, and those with c-ptsd tend to be survival-based instead of supply-based, which there is a difference, and I'm talking about that relationally, and we'll come back to that later too. Now, the overlap. I hope this clears up some of the confusion or changes the way we think about these two issues. Both can be the following. Both can be image focused, but in different ways. The narcissist is ruled by image, how others see them, but someone with c-ptsd can be worried about how they're seen and tend to hide flaws due to shame. Both can have low frustration tolerance. Those with these issues can live in a triggered state, kind of 24/7 at baseline. I know that I did. Both can be abandoning. Someone with NPD might leave relationships or marriages or abandon their children out of Machiavellian kind of motives, like those relationships aren't sparkly enough for them or they get in the way. Someone with c-ptsd might abandon similar people close to them and create profound pain and damage because they might feel like they can't tolerate the intimacy of those relationships. They might feel like they might contaminate those relationships. They might leave from being in a triggered state or being dissociative, or that they don't feel good enough for that relationship, or it could be about an addiction to, say, substances or love or sex. Those are some of the possibilities. Probably my main focus here in the overlap is both issues are often fueled by being incredibly self-consumed. Someone with NPD is consumed by their own image, acting out, and creates damage to support that fantasy of the image, while someone with c-ptsd can be self-consumed by their trauma survival and the narratives generated by that trauma survival. Think like narratives. I would be extremely self-consumed when I was triggered to feeling that others were, again, like letting me down. I was self-consumed when I would start a relationship for the wrong reason, and then I would feel trapped in the moral issues around getting out and not recognizing that I was creating all that. When we are extremely triggered at work and feel like someone knows we messed up, or that our inner child feels like like everyone at work had a meeting about us, or that we're about to get fired at any given moment, any given day, that's pretty self-consumed and being wrapped up in a trauma narrative. Both can be highly dissociative, like not in their body, really in their heads, in a narrative about people, places, and things. Both can be highly controlling, but for different reasons. A narcissist might get enraged that their partner forgot to bring, say, wine to a party. The rage is about that they don't have the wine now to elevate their image with the rest of the people at the party. A c-ptsd individual might also feel rage that their partner forgot to do the wine thing or bring the wine, because they go back to a childhood experience about either poverty or shame, or can't tolerate not providing something. Like, think having like rigid and controlling rules around being in the world to cover up a certain level of shame. Both issues are often ruled by narratives, like I mentioned, fights in our head, fixated on issues, either personal or political, from global warming to why your partner forgot the wine. NPD narratives are often about those not supporting their image, and CPTSD narratives are often about not being seen or protected or being safe or being heard. There's a difference to those things. In fantasies, NPD fantasies can be rooted in, like, say, being a rock star or a president, or living in an elevated state, almost being godlike. Where CPTSD fantasies can also be a rock star or being seen as helpful, or fantasies of finally being able to be financially safe. But they tend to not have such a rule the world kind of vibe to them, or finally being 1,000% appreciated by people in the case of the NPD who is covert. With NPD, the fantasies can often feel like realities, which is definitely problematic. Coming back to the NPD wording in the middle there of the fixed ego and the malleable ego for CPTSD. I know malleable is a weird word. I don't mean that it's easily manipulated emotionally, although that can be true, but I mean that the ego is more workable, or it's changeable, like a changeable ego. With many CPTSD individuals, ego can be affected by like recovery, or change, or boundaries, or some tough love lessons from someone. And I'm generalizing here. It depends on the person, as there are many CPTSD individuals who have no interest in changing or learning or recovering. Think of maybe your parents who don't have that significant cluster B stuff going on. Say they're alcoholic or workaholic or compartmentalized or massively codependent or extremely shut down or avoidant. Fixed ego is just that. NPD individuals tend to not be able to get out of their own way because they don't see that they are in their own way. An NPD caught embezzling won't admit any wrongdoing, or they might deflect it or make up stories because their ego is fixed. They couldn't have possibly done all that because they believe that they're innocent, or that their motives were justified given how they were treated. Their ego is fixed in how they see themselves, or they don't necessarily learn from their behavior. Many CPTSD individuals who are, say, caught embezzling, I know that sounds silly, but or it's a silly thing to pick, has a greater potential to learn from that. And it's like, oh gee, like I was really feeling entitled and wrong, and I took way too big of a risk and that backfired here. The ego is malleable, changeable, teachable. As a side note, someone with NPD might come across as having a malleable ego, or might become compliant, but that's more of a Machiavellian kind of shell game, to come across as like reformed, to gain some kind of gain to their image and that kind of behavior, that kind of manipulation. So now let's look at how non-overlapping factors and do some comparison to them. I'm pointing out how both CPTSD and NPD can be really difficult people, but the motives behind the difficulty, they're different. These are not exact opposites, they're more contrast to get a sense of both issues. A trait of NPD is being self-important, entitled, me first kind of energy. And I've paired that with the c-ptsd quality of self-sabotage. Someone with NPD will definitely take the last parachute in a plane going down with the argument that they are the most valuable person and they should get it, while someone with c-ptsd might refuse the parachute for not wanting to say, owe anyone anything, or not want to live at the expense of others. I know that that's a silly example, an extreme example, but just think about it. The trait of grandiosity with NPD is an opposite to the c-ptsd quality of shame. And remember in that last infographic about being shameless on the NPD side to being shameful on the c-ptsd side. And that is also applicable to the goofy parachute analogy. Someone with NPD is often relationally focused on supply. They get their kids or their partner or their partners or strangers to supply the means to uphold the image of themselves. Someone with c-ptsd is survival based. They often can't tolerate being alone or single for being triggered back to abandonment. There's a big difference in their relational motives going on there. An NPD individual might be highly relationally manipulative, either covert or overt, and both are highly damaging. With NPD, the manipulation is self-serving in relationships and can easily move from one relationship to another without grief or processing the transition. Relationships are the game where the NPD individual will practice manipulation, where someone with c-ptsd might control attachments or relationships out of their attachment wounds. And c-ptsds, they might abandon from a trigger place while the NPD does it from a supply place. c-ptsd might control the dynamics of like not wanting affection or be overly focused if their partner is cheating, but it's coming from the childhood wounding where someone with NPTSD is not connected to their childhood wounding. There's a big difference there. And another big difference is the lack of empathy versus the lack of affecting others. NPD is shameless, lack of remorse, lack of authenticity around empathy. And it can be fabricated to suit the moment, but it's not real. With c-ptsd, there's usually a lack of knowing that they are worthy of empathy, or they might confuse empathy with manipulation, and they can be triggered by that. c-ptsd can also have way too much empathy, as codependency is often a root issue with c-ptsd. Lack of affecting is the symptom where those with c-ptsd often feel invisible to others, and that you're shocked if your coworkers like you and they want to connect with you. c-ptsd often feels like living in a bubble, and sometimes you may hear me sort of say in my videos it's like growing up in a vacuum. c-ptsd individuals are often shocked when people see us, where NPD is like, why aren't you constantly seeing me? Lack of empathy and lack of affecting others or knowledge thereof are both rooted in not knowing how we come across in kind of a self-consumed way. Now let's explore what I'm offering is the most overlap between these two issues. The most important thing in the video is being self-consumed, or if you like self-involved, or if you like self-absorbed. All of those are like ballpark ideas about what I'm expressing. Both those with NPD and c-ptsd share the following self-consuming behaviors. Acting out from triggered narratives. Both can be like, you did that on purpose. Like, nobody gets me. Once again, I'm invisible. Both can be entitled, but that sense of entitlement is done in different ways. Both can leave relationships callously or easily, maybe for different reasons. Both can engage in or cause drama. Both can project, and I mean project parental figures onto others, not the traditional like, I'm not mad, you're mad kind of projection. Both can have a reserve of rage and can act from it. Both can be unaware of their impact on others. Say someone with c-ptsd may overly apologize from a neurotic shame-based place, and that's still not seeing the other person you're apologizing to, and they probably don't want all that apologetic energy from you, but you're so in the narrative. And yeah, it's definitely not narcissistic. I'm not comparing that to narcissistically raging at someone, but the rules kind of still apply to the narrative and not seeing the individual in front of us that we're apologizing to. Both can be unaware of the upset in others. Not all c-ptsd survivors are, but I find they can be on a spectrum between being overly aware of others, or they can be completely unaware of others and what's going on for them. Both can be self-seeking, say in relationships like I mentioned, but again for different reasons. Both can be unable to show up for others. A parent with NPD is too important to fully show up for their children, but a parent with regular old CPTSD might be unable to show up due to codependency or being focused on others, or they were raised without any kind of family connection and assume that not showing up for your kids is kind of how it's done, or that they'll mess up showing up so they don't bother doing it, or that they're too much in sort of some kind of pain. In no way am I minimizing that behavior or excusing. It is abusive parental behavior. I'm just listing non-NPD possibilities for the abusive parenting. Both are egoically defensive. They are difficult relationally, but for different reasons. Someone with CPTSD might be overly defensive about being called out on something and take it to a really huge place. Doesn't mean that they're a narcissist who might take being called out as an invitation to now a new personal war with whoever called them out. Both can be incredibly self-righteous, which is a top-tier clue that someone is in a triggered state, triggered to their childhood trauma, but they don't know it. When I had just started my childhood trauma work around the age of 20, I was really young, but I really had some self-consumed behaviors that I had a lot going on back then. Relationships were a mess. Either I was overly anxious, attached, or would leave things easily, like I mentioned. An example, my first childhood trauma group was at 9:30 on a Tuesday. And I was such a mess back then that I would often show up like 30 minutes late, 45 minutes late, and I would miss most of what my other group members had discussed or checked in with. And after a few months of that, you can imagine how triggering that is. They rightfully started to bring that issue up with me. But I was so consumed with shame that I almost couldn't handle it. And that a lot of that related to not knowing how I was affecting people, how I affected others. I had no idea that they actually noticed I was late because I grew up in a vacuum and I grew up in neglect. It's shocking when you think you're invisible and someone's just like, why are you tiptoeing? Do you resonate with that? So we can look at all of that self-consumed energy as simply having a narcissistic injury. It's there for good reason, and that term isn't just for those with NPD and they go into a rage because they have a narcissistic injury. Lots of us have them, and that's why we're probably confused and feel like NPD is an epidemic, which it isn't. We don't know how people affect us, which is evidence of being kind of self-consumed in a weird way. In addition to that, I was around 20, where developmentally we're just beginning to move into maturity and leaving like a natural self-consumed stage, I think. Like both things are true for like what I was like back then. So when you're thinking that someone is a narcissist, they actually just might be 23 and have never been parented like I was. In addition, I had a lot of trauma-based rage. I could cause drama because of the narratives in my head that ran me hard. And related to that, I also projected a lot. I projected a lot onto other people, my parental figures. I often felt somewhat entitled as having grown up in poverty. I looked at like the kids my age who were assisted into getting into college by their families. I looked at them with like disdain, and I looked at those families with disdain. And I had a lot of disgust for those who were better off. And I felt like I had the one up on them, like more common sense, like more kind of like blue collar kind of sensibilities. And that vibe really wasn't good for me. It really created a schism between me and a lot of other people. I was big on negativity and gossip and not knowing the impact I had on others because of that. And it would take me through my 20s into my 30s to grow out of all that self-consumed behaviors, and it took time in therapy. Would you have called me a narcissist for those things that I just listed? Would that have been accurate? So some final thoughts. My main thoughts on these two issues are that childhood trauma, CPTSD, is a self-consuming issue that can often look like narcissism. Number two is childhood trauma can turn us into being pretty miserable people. I know that back then I was really at my worst. It's not something that we would have chosen as kids if we were given the choice, but those with CPTSD have more diverse emotions and states, where I find that those with NPD are more in a predictable emotional vibe or existence, fixed versus malleable. The third topic is, with the current culture of online recovery being hyper-focused on the narcissistic parent, for good reasons and bad reasons, We are throwing around the term narcissist too easily, and we're often overly subscribing it, overly labeling it on people who we perceive as just difficult or they're self-focused. Number 4 is I see many childhood trauma survivors being very vigilant about narcissism or narcissistic people. And while I get it as part of a process, I think complete recovery looks like losing our interest in our family system and therefore losing our interest in the narcissistic personality disorder. This is different in perpetually doing research on the narcissist. And I'm sorry if you feel called out here, but having like an unofficial PhD on the issue is more like stewing in the issue versus recovering from it. In no way am I saying get over it. I'm just saying more focus on the therapy and the healing rather than the issue. A weird analogy here. If we spend years researching hammers, everything's going to start to look like nails. Number 5, I think I see those with CPTSD as able to heal and recover, but not everyone can, or not everyone is interested in that, which is okay. Those with NPD, coming back to that fixed ego thing, as individuals like my father, I find that they have no interest or insight or therefore don't need therapy, and their ego is fixed, while CPTSD, there's more likelihood for some insight and some motivation for change. But again, some with CPTSD don't want to open any of that up, and I totally respect that. My father had NPD and was profoundly abusive and damaging to our relationship and my development and the family legacy. And it took over a decade to recover, but I don't really toss and turn at night about who he was or what he did. And being in good therapy and recovery for many years and processing and working with my inner child brought me to that place of kind of not caring about what happened or him anymore, which is really, really nice. So moving on, here is what to do if you're confused. If you're confused if the person who ghosted you or your boss or the family member or that bad roommate or yourself or your friends or that teacher or that young person who rear-ended you, so to think, are they really a narcissist? I think the defining piece of NPD is that vibe of self-importance, of martyrdom, that they can't be gotten through to. And that's all in this game of ego and conquest, and that there's this crazy making element to them, and that there is retribution or vindictive sneaky behaviors or provocative statements, or the intent focus on you in the beginning, like love bombing or putting you up on a pedestal. Those are some top tier signs. As a side note, this is common for what I see with my clients. If you fear that you won't be able to recognize someone like that again, or that someone like that will come back into your life, like having to have a narcissistic personality disorder, I really suggest working in your family system and work on your trauma about what happened to you to process that, and you'll most likely reclaim in a good enough way the ability to see it for what it is up front. I don't think constantly researching gets our intuition back. I think that just makes us more hypervigilant. But what if that person you're involved with is difficult because they grew up like you, but maybe in just different ways? And I'm saying this for perspective. I'm not trying to minimize. I'm not trying to shame you into being more compassionate, just to change the way we look at things. What if they behave narcissistically like I did, but they aren't the real deal? Maybe they are dismissive, avoidant because their parent died, and then an evil step-parent kind of moved in, and now they can't tolerate closeness, but they aren't aware of their story in that way. What if that boss can't deal with conflict and they never step in or advocate for you because they grew up with an abusive bipolar parent, and their inner child can't tolerate the tension because escalation was always terrifying for them? Or that no one ever advocated for them, so it's kind of a foreign possibility from them. They never think about it. It doesn't mean that they're a covert narcissist. What if that person who breaks up with us over text grew up totally neglected and unparented around doing the right thing, and they can't handle showing up and honoring their time with us in the relationship? All of that is narcissistic and self-consuming, sure, but it isn't necessarily the real deal. What if those with CPTSD had access to good therapy and good recovery and were able to own authentically their kind of self-consuming behaviors? There's a big caveat again, if they were interested in it And but I think that malleable egos have more capacity for change if they were to seek that out. And at some point, I'd like to do a video on how people are drawn to recovery and healing stuff, and they really soak it in like a sponge. And some folks with CPTSD are incredibly therapy resistant, incredibly insight resistant, if you think about your parents in some ways. Whew, that was a lot of info to throw at you guys. I hope it's helpful. I hope you're not more confused. Leave a comment. I would love to hear what you think. I'd love to know if you ever wonder if your self-consumed usually causes kind of a shame attack in us. Can you relate that to your childhood? How do you feel about my suggestion to stop focusing or researching the NPD? You probably know enough by now. Is that suggestion annoying to you or dangerous to you in some way? I would love to know why. And as always, may you be filled with loving kindness. May you be well. May you be peaceful and at ease, and may you be joyous. And I will see you next time.